The piece had no title, only a number. Lot 47. The catalog described it like this: cedar wood sculpture, hand-carved technique, 94 centimeters tall. Anonymous contemporary artist. Provenance: private collection, Mexico City. Estimated value: $280,000 to $350,000. Anonymous. That word had been the gallery owner's decision. The man who carved that piece had never called himself anonymous. He simply hadn't put his name on it because no one had asked him to when he sold it, 8 years earlier, for 4,000 pesos to a man who bought it for his living room and never asked who had made it. That night, in the ballroom of the Camino Real Hotel, with 400 people and glasses of champagne and spotlights calibrated so the wood would shine in exactly the right way, Lot 47 sat at the center of the room. And the man who had carved it stood at the back of the ballroom, with hands that none of the 400 guests could have connected to something like that. Sebastián Rojas Vargas was 41 years old and lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in the Colonia Doctors. He worked at a hardware store Monday through Saturday, 6 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon. His daughter, Amalia, was 8 years old and had the specific habit of reorganizing her crayons by color temperature instead of standard color order, which he found deeply reasonable. He wasn't a sculptor. Or more precisely, he wasn't a sculptor in the way people with that word on their business cards are sculptors. He was someone who carved wood in the afternoons, after picking up Amalia from school, while she did homework at the living room table, and he worked in the backyard with the tools his father had left him when he died. Gouges, chisels, a wooden mallet with exactly the weight he needed in his hand to feel like he was doing something right. He had learned from his father. His father had learned from his grandfather. No one in the family had ever put a name on anything because they'd never needed to. The piece that was now Lot 47, he had carved 9 years ago. Amalia hadn't been born yet. His wife Petra was still alive. It was a standing female figure, 40 centimeters of red cedar, carved over a 6-week period when Petra had an infection the doctors didn't fully understand yet, and Sebastián carved at night because he couldn't sleep, and carving was the only thing his hands knew how to do when his mind couldn't settle. When Petra recovered, the piece was finished. When the neighbor, a man named Don Aurelio who bought and sold things without much method, saw it and offered 4,000 pesos, Sebastián sold it without thinking too much about it. He needed the money for Petra's medication. Don Aurelio wanted it to decorate. Sebastián never found out what happened to it after that. Until Amalia came home from school one Tuesday with a printed flyer she'd found on the subway floor. It was an announcement for a charity auction at the Camino Real. On the second page was a black and white photo of Lot 47. Amalia didn't know why she'd picked it up. "It's pretty," she said, setting it on the table. Sebastián looked at it for 4 seconds. Then he picked it up. The shape of the shoulders. The angle of the head. The way the wood flowed from the hip upward in a single continuous line that had taken him 3 nights to get right without it breaking. He recognized it the way you recognize something that came out of your own hands, not with your eyes, but with something deeper that has no precise name. "Dad," said Amalia. "Are you okay?" "Yes," said Sebastián. "This one is yours." "What do you mean it's mine?" "I made it. Before you were born. It's from the time your mom was sick." Amalia looked at the photo for a long moment. "And they're going to sell it?" "Looks like it. How much is it worth?" Sebastián looked at the estimated price at the bottom of the flyer. He read it twice. "More than I make in 10 years, he said quietly. He didn't go to the auction to claim anything. There was nothing to claim. He'd sold it freely, with no rights contract, no signature of authorship. In the art world, the anonymity had protected him from every possible legal complication and, at the same time, had left him with none of the benefits. He went because Amalia asked if they could go see it. "Just see it?" Sebastián asked. "Just see it," said Amalia. "So we know where it's going to live afterward." That logic, that things needed to know where they were going to live, was entirely characteristic of Amalia, and Sebastián found no argument against it. They borrowed clothes from a cousin. Sebastián's suit was slightly too wide in the shoulders and an inch too short in the pants. Amalia wore a navy blue dress her Aunt Consuelo had sent for the holidays, which she had decided to save for something important. An art auction at the Camino Real, she determined, qualified. The ballroom was exactly what Sebastián expected, and nothing like what Amalia had imagined. "I thought it would be weirder," Amalia whispered, looking at the people with their champagne glasses and half-volume conversations. "Weirder how? Like more artistic. Everyone looks the same." Sebastián didn't answer, but he didn't find an argument against it either. They were seated in a row near the back of the room. Lot 47 sat at the center of the room, lit by 3 spotlights that gave the wood a dark copper tone Sebastián didn't immediately recognize. Not because the piece was different, but because he'd never seen it under that kind of light. At the hardware store, the light was fluorescent. In the backyard of the Colonia Doctors, the light was sunset light. Under museum spotlights, the wood was something else entirely. Amalia saw it from a distance and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "It looks like Mom." Sebastián didn't answer. But it did. It did look like her. The trouble started during the pre-auction cocktail hour, when a man named Gerardo Montoya, whose business card read Private Collector and Emerging Art Investor, approached Lot 47 to examine it up close and noticed Sebastián standing beside him, studying the base of the figure with the specific attention of someone who knows every centimeter of what he's looking at. "Interested," said Montoya, in the friendly tone of someone who has already decided the person in front of him isn't his competition. "It caught my eye," said Sebastián. Montoya looked at the suit. The cut of the shoulders. Sebastián's hands, resting lightly on the metal safety rail, large, with the specific marks of someone who works wood or cement or anything requiring sustained pressure against hard surfaces. "It's an extraordinary piece," said Montoya, turning back to the figure. "The carving work is exceptional. You can tell whoever made it had a very specific relationship with the material. Not technical, personal." "Do you know who made it?" Sebastián asked. "Anonymous, according to the catalog. Probably someone who didn't know what they had." Montoya took a sip of champagne. "Happens a lot. Talent without formal training rarely knows how to recognize its own value." Sebastián said nothing. Montoya glanced again at Sebastián's hands on the metal rail. "Do you work with your hands?" "Yes." "Construction." "Hardware store." Montoya smiled the way someone smiles when they consider a conversation to have reached its natural limit. "Interesting that this kind of work appeals to you," he said. "Though I suppose anyone can appreciate art from anywhere." He said that last part in the tone of someone who doesn't entirely believe it. Then he excused himself to go greet someone more important. 10 feet away, a woman named Lucia Iterb had heard the entire conversation. Lucia was the director of the city's Museum of Folk Art. Not the biggest museum, but the most honest one, the kind that bought work from artisans before the artisans became trendy. She'd spent 20 years learning to tell the difference between art that wanted to be seen and art that simply was. She'd been looking at Lot 47 for 40 minutes that afternoon, before the doors opened. And she'd been watching Sebastián's hands on the rail with a different kind of attention than Montoya's. Not with disdain. With recognition. She approached after Montoya left. "Excuse me," she said. "Do you know this piece?" Sebastián looked at her. "Why do you ask?" "Because you've spent 10 minutes looking at the base. And the base is the hardest part." A pause. "The bevel width at the base is exactly 3 millimeters all the way around. That's not a power tool. That's a number 4 gouge, right-hand dominant, constant pressure. Someone who's carved wood for years." Sebastián looked at her for a moment. "Do you work in art?" "I run a museum." She extended her hand. "Lucia Iterb." "Sebastián Rojas." "And you, Sebastián Rojas, what's your relationship to Lot 47? Sebastián looked at the figure under the spotlights. "I carved it." The silence that followed had the specific quality of a moment when something that should have been obvious finally is. "When?" 9 years ago. I sold it to a neighbor for 4,000 pesos. Lucia looked at him. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't say it was unfair. She said, "Did you make it during something specific?" "While my wife was sick. I carved at night because I couldn't sleep." And the angle of the head. Was that a technical decision or a personal one? Sebastián looked at her with slight surprise. Personal, he said. It's the angle she slept in at the hospital. Head tilted slightly to the left. Lucia looked at him for a long moment. Where is your wife now? She died 4 years after I made this piece. Amalia found her father and Lucia talking next to the figure when she came back from getting water. She looked at Lucia with the direct evaluation of an 8-year-old. Do you know my dad made that? She said, pointing at lot 47. I just found out, said Lucia. I knew when I saw the photo on the subway. Amalia examined the figure closely. It has the same hands as my dad when he carves. See how the fingers are spread like that? My dad always spreads his fingers when he's holding something that matters to him. Lucia looked at the figure. The fingers of the cedar figure, barely represented, suggested rather than detailed, had exactly that spread. Does your dad teach you to carve? Lucia asked. I'm learning, said Amalia. I still can't get the curve right. Curves are hard. Curves are the hardest part, Lucia agreed. What have you carved? A bird. But it came out more like a potato. Sebastián made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was close enough. Lucia looked at the two of them, the father with the big hands and the suit that didn't quite fit, and the girl in the navy dress who had decided an art auction qualified as something important. Can I ask you something, Amalia? Yes. Why did you come tonight? Amalia thought about it with her usual seriousness. To find out where it's going to live after the auction. And what if it ends up living with someone who doesn't know it's your dad's? Then that person is going to live with something they don't fully understand, said Amalia. But the piece knows. Things someone makes with a lot of care always know where they come from, even if the person who has them doesn't know. The room around them carried on with its noise of 400 conversations. Lucia looked at the cedar figure under the spotlights. Then she looked at Sebastián. Do you have more work? In the backyard. A few pieces. How many? Sebastián thought about it. About 30. From the last 9 years. 30 pieces in 9 years. Lucia did some silent math. Would you be willing to let someone see them? The auction began at 9. Lot 47 came up as the 12th item of the night. Bidding opened at $280,000. Sebastián and Amalia watched from their row at the back of the room. Gerardo Montoya raised his paddle 3 times. Someone else bid. Montoya bid again. In the end, Lot 47 sold for $410,000 to a phone bidder whose identity was not disclosed. The gavel fell. Amalia took her father's hand. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, You know what I'm wondering? What? Whether whoever bought it is going to put it somewhere with light. Sebastián looked at her. Why does that matter? Because the wood needs light. If they put it in a dark room, the wood gets sad. She said it with total scientific conviction. Cedar especially. It's very sensitive. Sebastián squeezed her hand. Gerardo Montoya found them on the way out. Not both of them, just Sebastián, while Amalia was checking out the dessert table. Enjoy the evening, said Montoya. It was interesting. Montoya glanced toward the space where Lot 47 had stood. $410,000. More than expected. Someone with a good eye. Yes. You know, I've been in this world for 20 years, and it still amazes me that someone without formal training could produce something at that level. Montoya turned his glass in his hand. Anonymous. Natural talent. It happens. But it's rare. Sebastián looked at him. Why rare? Because untrained talent tends to be inconsistent. One brilliant piece among 50 mediocre ones. The untrained eye doesn't know how to replicate what it does well. Sebastián nodded, like someone listening to an opinion he doesn't fully agree with but chooses not to argue with out loud. It was Lucia who appeared at that moment. She had a glass in one hand and what looked like a card in the other. Gerardo, she said. Have you met the artist behind Lot 47? Montoya looked at her. It was anonymous. Not anymore. Lucia gestured toward Sebastián with a casualness that asked no permission. Sebastián Rojas. He carved it 9 years ago while his wife was hospitalized. He has 30 more pieces at his home in the Colonia Doctors that I'm going to see next week to evaluate for a group show at the museum. The silence that followed lasted exactly as long as it takes a person to process that they've been speaking with careful contempt toward someone who turned out to be the source of the very thing they just admired. Montoya looked at Sebastián's hands. The same hands he'd seen on the metal rail. The same hands that had built what had just sold for $410,000. I didn't know, Montoya said finally. No, said Sebastián. Without harshness. Without triumph. Just a confirmation. You didn't know. Lucia went to the apartment in the Colonia Doctors the following Saturday. Sebastián had arranged the pieces in the backyard as best he could. Some on a table, some directly on the ground, 2 hung on the wall with nails he'd put up himself. Lucia walked among them for 40 minutes, saying almost nothing. Amalia followed her, also in silence, which was unusual for Amalia but seemed fitting for the occasion. Sebastián waited, sitting on the back step with a cup of coffee he didn't drink. When Lucia finished, she sat down next to him on the step. 19 of the 30 interest me for the show. Sebastián nodded. When? In 4 months. We'd need to photograph them, document provenance, write the wall text. A pause. This time with your name on it. Sebastián looked out at the yard. The pieces in the afternoon light of the Colonia Doctors. The light wasn't museum light. It was the light they'd always had. What happens with lot 47, he said. It's already sold. There's nothing to be done about it legally. Lucia looked at him. But I want the show's text to say where it started. That it came from this backyard. That it was made by a man who works at a hardware store and learned from his father and carved at night when his wife was sick. Sebastián didn't answer right away. Why does that matter? Because it changes what the piece means. Not for the buyer. For everyone else who sees it and thinks art comes from specific places with specific names and diplomas on the wall. Amalia, who had been listening from the doorway with her juice box straw, said, I think it matters. Because if people know my dad made it from this backyard, then they know that from this backyard you can make something worth $410,000. Lucia looked at her. Exactly that. Amalia nodded, satisfied with this scientific confirmation, and disappeared back inside. The exhibition opened 4 months later at the Museum of Folk Art. It was simply called Hands. The wall text at the entrance read, Sebastián Rojas Vargas learned to carve wood from his father, who learned from his grandfather. He works at a hardware store Monday through Saturday, 6 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon. The pieces in this exhibition were created in the afternoons, in the backyard of his apartment in the Colonia Doctors, with tools that weigh exactly what they need to weigh in his hand. None of them were made for a museum. All of them ended up in one anyway. Lot 47 never went back to the backyard. But 3 months after the exhibition opened, a letter arrived at the museum. The anonymous buyer turned out to be an art foundation that acquired work from artists without a platform and donated it to regional museums. The letter said that, after reading the exhibition's wall text, the foundation had decided the cedar figure should be in a collection accessible to the public. They asked whether the Museum of Folk Art would be interested in receiving it. Lucia called Sebastián that afternoon. Sebastián listened to the news in silence. Then he said, Can I ask you something? Yes. Where are they going to put it? We have a central space with natural light all day. Sebastián said nothing for a moment. Then, Amalia is going to want to know that. Why? She was worried they'd put it in a dark room. Cedar, according to her, is very sensitive. Lucia laughed. The real laugh of someone who spent 20 years in the art world and still finds that a child's honesty is the best argument there is. Tell her it's going to have all the light it needs. That afternoon, Sebastián went back to the yard. He picked up the number 4 gouge. A block of cedar waited for him on the workbench. He'd bought it 2 weeks earlier without knowing yet what it would become. Amalia got home from school at 3:15, set her backpack on the chair, and sat down on the step with her crayons without asking anything. After 10 minutes, without looking up from her crayons, she said, "What's it going to be?" "I don't know yet," said Sebastián. "When will you know?" "When it starts to look like something." Amalia nodded with her usual seriousness. "I think it's going to be something good," she said. Sebastián raised the gouge. The cedar smelled exactly the way it always had. Like resin and thyme. Like something that didn't have a shape yet, but that his hands already knew.